They executed citizens by feeding them poison that paralyzed their bodies inch by inch, while keeping their minds perfectly alert until the final moment their hearts stopped beating, and they called it merciful. The same civilization that gave us democracy, philosophy, and the Olympic Games also created 5 execution methods so psychologically devastating that they reveal the darkest corners of human justice. These aren't just deaths, they're calculated rituals of suffering, designed by what was supposedly the most advanced society of its time. Here are the 5 most haunting execution methods from ancient Greece. Methods so disturbing, they force us to question everything we thought we knew about this glorified civilization. Stay with us until the end, because the final method was so horrific it was disguised as a religious ceremony and has been deliberately obscured in most history books. Imagine being accused of a crime in the morning and dead by sunset, with no appeals, no lengthy processes, just swift, inescapable judgment. In Athens, justice wasn't just blind, it was ruthlessly efficient. The city that invented democracy also created a system where juries of 501, 1001, or even 1501 male citizens would decide your fate with a simple majority vote. The verdict was implemented immediately. You wouldn't languish in prison awaiting execution like in our modern system. From accusation to death could take less than 24 hours. The psychological terror of such swift justice is almost impossible for our modern minds to comprehend. This urgency wasn't born from cruelty, but from a fundamentally different understanding of crime itself. For the Greeks, a criminal act wasn't just a violation of law. It was a pollution, a miasma that contaminated the entire community. The execution wasn't punishment, it was purification. Trials took place in the open air, with prosecutors and defendants each allotted measured time by water clocks. Your life literally depended on your rhetorical skills, or your ability to hire a skilled speechwriter if you were wealthy. The selection of jurors was equally unnerving. Each morning, citizens who wished to serve would gather at the courthouse. A complex lottery system using colored tokens and allotment machines determined who would judge which cases. This randomness was meant to prevent corruption, but it also meant your fate rested in the hands of whoever happened to be selected that day. Consider the fate of Phryne, a famous courtesan charged with impiety, the same crime that killed Socrates. According to legend, her defender Hyperides, realizing he was losing the case, dramatically tore open her robe to expose her breasts to the all-male jury. Moved by her beauty, which they took as evidence of divine favor, they acquitted her. Justice in Athens was as much about emotion and spectacle as it was about evidence. And this brings us to our first method, perhaps the most famous execution in Western history. What if you could feel your own body die piece by piece, but your mind remained perfectly clear until the final moment? This was the fate of history's most famous philosophical martyr, Socrates. After being condemned for corrupting the youth and questioning the gods, the 70-year-old philosopher was sentenced to a punishment considered humane by Athenian standards. But this mercy contained a psychological torture more sophisticated than any physical pain. The condemned would drink a cup of poison hemlock, then begin a final walk around their cell. As minutes passed, a creeping numbness would begin in their feet. Then slowly, methodically, the paralysis would climb. First the feet, then the ankles, the calves, the knees. As the paralysis rose through the body, victims remained completely conscious, able to describe the sensation of their own body shutting down. They could speak until the paralysis reached their diaphragm, making breathing increasingly difficult. Death came only when the paralysis finally reached the heart. The terror wasn't in pain, but in awareness. Imagine counting down the inches between the advancing numbness and your still beating heart, knowing exactly when death would arrive. Yet the Athenians considered this dignified. Family could visit and final words could be spoken. The body would be properly prepared for burial, a courtesy not extended to those who suffered our next method of execution. But there was another punishment that didn't technically kill you at all, yet many considered it worse than death. What could be worse than execution? Imagine waking up one morning as a respected citizen, only to discover that by nightfall you'll be forced to leave everything you've ever known, your family, your home, your identity, without even being told what crime you committed. This was ostracism, the social death that made ancient Greek democracy truly terrifying. Once each year, Athenian citizens could anonymously vote to banish anyone from the city for 10 years. No trial, no specific accusation, no defense allowed. If 6,000 votes were cast, the person with the most had just 10 days to disappear. The condemned kept their property and their citizenship, but they lost everything that made life meaningful in Greek society: religious participation, family connections, political rights, and the ability to defend their legacy. Think about what this meant in a world without phones, internet, or rapid transit. Being ostracized didn't just mean losing your social standing. It meant being erased from society while still alive, watching from afar as your reputation was dismantled and your accomplishments forgotten. Even heroes weren't immune. Themistocles, who saved Greece from Persian invasion, found himself ostracized by the very people he had saved. The psychological sophistication of this punishment reveals something profound about Greek values. For a culture obsessed with glory and remembrance, forcing someone to live as a ghost, present in the world but removed from memory, was perhaps more brutal than any physical execution. But for those who committed crimes against the gods themselves, a far more public and prolonged death awaited. This next punishment left people alive for days, while an entire city watched them die. For crimes considered particularly offensive to the gods, the Greeks devised a method that transformed death into public theater: execution by exposure. Imagine being stripped naked, chained to a stake at a busy intersection, and left to die slowly from hunger, thirst, and exposure to the elements. You were offered no shelter from the scorching Mediterranean sun, or protection from freezing night temperatures. No escape from the insects, birds, and eventually wild dogs that would begin feeding on your still living flesh. What made this method uniquely disturbing wasn't just the physical suffering, but the civic participation it required. Citizens walking to the market would pass you. Children would see you. Former friends would avert their eyes. Your slow deterioration became a lesson for the community. This is what becomes of those who offend the gods. Day by day, your humanity would visibly erode. Dehydration would crack your lips and skin. Hunger would hollow your cheeks. Exposure would blister and blacken your flesh. The sophisticated citizens of Athens would watch this transformation not with horror, but with approval. Your suffering was cleansing the pollution your crime had brought to their city. Archaeological evidence suggests that some Greek cities had designated exposure sites, places that became permanently associated with death and suffering in the public imagination. In Sparta, criminals might be thrown into the Kiadas, a cave-like prison where they would slowly starve in darkness. But as brutal as exposure was, it still offered the possibility, however remote, of being seen or heard during your final days. Our next method stripped away even that small comfort by sending the condemned literally beyond the boundaries of civilization. Sometimes the most terrifying aspect of execution wasn't the method itself, but who carried it out. In certain Greek cities, particularly Sparta, some crimes required death at the hands of the entire community. Execution by stoning or clubbing was a civic obligation that turned every citizen into an executioner. This method was typically reserved for crimes that threatened the social fabric itself: soldiers who showed cowardice in battle, helots who rebelled, or citizens who betrayed military secrets to enemies. The procedure was grimly democratic. After a brief trial, even briefer in Sparta than in Athens, the condemned would be brought to a public space. Citizens, sometimes including women and older children, would surround them in a circle. At a signal from a magistrate, the stoning would begin. What makes this method particularly disturbing is its psychological dimension for both victim and participants. For the condemned, death came not from an anonymous executioner, but from the faces of neighbors, former friends, and fellow citizens. Each stone a personal rejection, each blow a communal condemnation. For participants, the method cleverly distributed moral responsibility. No single stone caused death. Everyone shared the burden equally. This collective action reinforced social cohesion, while transforming execution from a spectator event into a participatory ritual. Archaeological evidence from several Greek sites has uncovered remains bearing the distinctive trauma patterns of stoning. Multiple blunt force injuries to the skull and upper body, delivered from different angles. Some victims appear to have been partially buried before the stoning began, prolonging their suffering while ensuring they couldn't escape. In Sparta, execution by clubbing took on an additional layer of horror. The agoge, Sparta's infamous military training system, sometimes forced young men in training to participate in the execution of helots who had attempted escape. This served both as punishment for the slave and as a lesson in unflinching brutality for future warriors. But as communal as stoning was, it still occurred within the boundaries of the city, within civilization. For the worst offenders, death came in a place where no one could hear their screams. What happens to those who commit the worst crimes against the state? In Athens, they disappeared forever, literally thrown away like garbage and erased from memory. The Barathron was a deep chasm on the outskirts of Athens that served as both execution site and mass grave for the city's worst offenders. Criminals condemned to this fate were taken to the edge of this natural pit and pushed in. The fall itself might kill you instantly, if you were lucky. If not, you faced a slower death from injuries, exposure, and starvation at the bottom of a pit, reportedly lined with spikes or sharp rocks. But the physical death was only part of the punishment. The true horror lay in what happened after. Absolutely nothing. Your body remained unburied at the bottom of the pit. A devastating fate in a culture that believed proper burial rites were essential for the soul's journey to the afterlife. Without these rituals, Greeks believed the soul would wander eternally at the boundaries between worlds, never finding peace. The symbolism was unmistakable. By casting criminals into the Barathron, Athens was not merely executing them, but removing them from the community both physically and spiritually, a complete erasure. To this day, the exact location of the Barathron has never been conclusively identified by archaeologists. Think about the implications. Somewhere on the outskirts of modern Athens lies a pit, potentially filled with the unburied remains of ancient criminals, their souls, according to Greek belief, still wandering restlessly after 2,500 years. But even the Barathron pales in comparison to our final method, a punishment so disturbing. It blurred the line between execution and human sacrifice. One form of execution was reserved only for those who violated the most sacred laws, and it was disguised as a religious ceremony to make the horror more palatable. In several Greek cities, those who committed religious crimes faced a fate that transformed their deaths into offerings to the gods. Priestesses who broke their vows of chastity, temple robbers who stole sacred objects, those who revealed secret religious rites, all might find themselves processed not through normal courts, but through religious tribunals. Their deaths weren't called executions, but purifications or appeasements. The most notorious of these sacred punishments took place at religious sites, where criminals were thrown from towering cliffs as human sacrifices, thinly disguised as judicial sentences. On the island of Leucas, during festivals dedicated to Apollo, condemned criminals would be taken to the island's white cliffs overlooking the sea. Before being thrown, they would be dressed in ritual garments and adorned with feathers and live birds, supposedly to slow their fall. This bizarre addition did nothing to prevent death. It merely transformed the execution into ritual spectacle. As the criminal plummeted toward the sea, their flailing body, trailing feathers, and panicked birds created a macabre vision for onlookers gathered below. If by some miracle the fall didn't kill them, boats waited to ensure they never reached shore alive. The community would participate in purification rituals after these deaths, washing away the spiritual pollution with the physical removal of the offender. The execution methods of ancient Greece weren't just about ending lives. They were sophisticated psychological instruments designed to make statements about those lives and their place in society. In the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, justice took forms that would horrify us today. The same culture that gave us Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle also threw living people off cliffs and left them to rot in pits as offerings to the gods. This contradiction reveals something profound about human societies. Even the most intellectually advanced civilization of its time embraced ritualized cruelty when it felt threatened. The line between justice and vengeance, between punishment and purification, has always been thinner than we might like to admit. Were these punishments justice, or something much darker? Which of these ancient punishments disturbed you the most, and why? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching Nefarious History, and if you found this journey into the darker side of ancient Greece compelling, subscribe for more explorations of history's shadowed corners. Next week, we'll uncover the forgotten massacres of the English Civil War, atrocities so shocking they've been deliberately erased from most history books.